Students are making these dream apartments for these Bendy Men figurines. They're making them out of cardboard and little wooden pieces. They're putting everything together with hot glue guns. They're using scrapbooking paper. And this tutorial is about how to do the sewing, how to add fabric, how to make a little beanbag chair, a pillow, a blanket. So we're going to get right into it. So we'll start out by measuring out the thread. I'm going to take a piece of thread and I'm going to measure it by the distance between my arms when I spread them all the way out. So I'm going to just take the thread, I'm going to spread my arms all the way out, and I'm going to cut the thread with the scissors. Don't try and just pull the thread so it snaps, because then the end will be frayed and it'll be almost impossible to thread the needle. The trick with threading a needle is to make sure you can see through the eye of the needle and push the thread through away from you through the eye of the needle. If you do that, you'll get it right every time. If you try and thread from left to right, you might end up putting the thread in the wrong place. So pull the thread all the way through the needle until the two ends match. And then what you do is you wrap the thread around your finger, not too tight, but 3 or 4 times. But don't make it too tight. So you wrap it around the two ends together, and then you wrap it around your finger 3 or 4 times, and then you roll your pointer and your thumb back and forth until the whole thing twists a lot. Then let go of that twist, and you go all the way back to the needle, and you pull along the thread, and when you get to that twist, it's going to form into a large knot. So that's what you want. You want that big knot at the end. So it's basically 2 pieces of thread. It's a double thread knotted at the very end. And that's the way you have to do it. If you do it any other way, the knot won't be at the end and the needle will get caught as you try and pull it through the fabric. So I'm taking my fabric and I'm folding it over so that it's inside out. I'm pinning it together so that the pattern is hidden on the inside, and you'll see why later. When you poke the pins through, you have to see both the head of the pin and the end of the pin. You can't just poke them straight through. So you take the pin, you poke it down, and then you pop it up again so you see the pointy side and the head of the pin. And then you take your thread and needle, and that holds the fabric in place. And then you're gonna start taking out the pins one at a time as you start sewing. So I'll take my first pin out, I put it in the pin cushion, and I'm going to just start with what's called a running stitch. So that's just popping it up and down, joining the 2 pieces of fabric together without pulling the needle all the way through. So you do that along one side, and then you pull the needle through, and then you have to flatten out the fabric. You don't want it to be bunched or pinched. So you flatten it out, and then you do the second side exactly the same way. You take out the next pin and you do what's called a running stitch. When you are done with the second side, don't do the third side. I'll show you what to do. So you go through, you do the second side, you pull it all the way through. After you've poked it in and out a whole bunch of times, you flatten out the fabric so that it's not bunched. And you're going to leave that last side not sewed. And instead, you're going to go back to the beginning again. But this time, you're going to go in between all your stitches. So you're going to poke your needle through at the end of the first stitch. And you're just going to keep going so that you end up with a solid line of stitches, because your next row of stitches is going to go in between your previous stitches. So you'll end up with a solid line of stitches. When you're done and you have 3 sides sewed, well, one side is just the folded over fabric, but the other 2 sides are sewed and you've got one side open, it's time to cut the thread. But you can't just cut the thread, because when it gets pulled apart, it would just all come out. So you have to tie a knot at the end. And there's a special way to tie the knot that I'm going to show you. As soon as I get back to the beginning where I started again, my last stitch is going to be something called a chain stitch. So that chain stitch is actually how you tie the knot. I'm going to show you what to do. You just make a single stitch in the same place. You poke the needle up. And then you slowly pull it, but not all the way through. So you see that loop? You're going to actually, instead of pulling it all the way through, you're going to make the needle go through that loop. And then you pull it tight. And then you can cut the thread. That's a chain stitch. That's what it's called. And the chain stitch is actually your knot at the end of the thread. If you don't do that chain stitch, all your stitches will come out when you stuff your pillow. So now that I'm done, I'm going to turn the pillow inside out. And now you can see the nice pretty pattern on the inside, on the outside. And all the stitches and the raw edge of the fabric are hidden on the inside. So now it's time to put the stuffing in. And once it's stuffed, you don't want the raw edges from that last side to show. So what you're going to do is you're going to fold them in on themselves, and then you're going to pin that closed before you sew it, and you're going to use a totally different stitch in order to close that last side, which I'm going to show you right now. So once you've folded them in on themselves, you're going to pin it closed. And then you're going to use a type of stitch called a back stitch, which I'm going to show you. And close it. Use a pin to keep it in place. And then I need to get another nice long piece of thread. Remember, you measure the thread by just how much thread is between your arms when you spread them apart. You don't want to take any more thread than that, because if you take too much thread at one time, it'll tangle. If you take too little thread, you will run out of thread before you get to make your chain stitch. When you thread your needle, you look through the eye of the needle and you poke the thread away from yourself. And that's how you thread a needle. And then you make sure that you pull the ends together and you roll them around your fingers. And then thumb and pointer up and down until they all twist together. And then you pull the thread tight to make the knot. This is how my mom taught me to sew when I was a little kid. When I was about 5 years old, my mother taught me how to sew. Anyway, you do not want the knot to show when you close it up. So notice how I'm tucking the knot inside. I'm tucking it in between so that it's not visible. And then I'm going to make what's called a back stitch, which is, it's like I used to call it, when I used to teach sewing, I used to call it the invisible stitch. So see, I'm tucking the knot in so it's not visible. And what you do is you're going to just, instead of wrapping the thread around the edge so that the thread ends up showing, you're going to poke the needle in right next to where the thread came out. But when you pull it through to the other side, you're going to put the needle at an angle, if that makes sense. And then you flip it over and you find exactly where the thread came out. And you're going to poke it right next to where the thread came out, but you're going to poke it through at an angle so it comes out slightly farther down the fabric. So each stitch is going to only be visible it's almost going to look like a tiny dot or pinprick on each side. The main part of the thread is actually on the inside of your project. So that's why it's called the back stitch, because all the stitching is on the back. All the visible stitching is on the back, and all the invisible stitching is on the front. When I taught this to younger students, I used to call it the invisible stitch. So you very carefully use your invisible stitch all the way down. Just poke it through right where the thread came out, but at an angle, and then you pull it through, and then when you go back, you poke it through, but you angle it. It's that angling of the needle that allows your thread to progress down the side of the pillow. But all the visible thread will be in the inside, in between the two pieces of fabric where nobody sees it. So you'll get this nice, neat, folded last side to your pillow. And then, of course, when you get to the end, you do your chain stitch, where you make a stitch, and right before you pull it all the way tight, you go through the loop. And that chain stitch is your knot at the end. There we go. Poke it through. There we go. Through the loop. Pull it tight. That's your knot. And then you can cut the thread. You can't cut the thread until you've gone through the loop. And you only have to make one chain stitch, and it's plenty strong. It'll keep the thread in place. But without that chain stitch at the end, all your stitches will come out. So there's Mr. Bendy Man's pillow. Let's cut any extra thread there, and we can put it under his head and keep him nice and comfy. What do you think, Mr. Bendy Man?